Hoboken, so I got to watch the police row by my house in a boat while calling us on bullhorns to not come outside, and then we got to watch the National Guard roll by on tanks. So I'm going to read a little, very short section from my book, The Secret Life of Objects, and because it takes place in India and Manhattan and Hoboken, and so there's a postscript to this. The piece is, this is a memoir about how our things tell our stories, and this piece is called The Moonstone Ring. My future husband bought the ring in India in 1981 with the idea that he would give it to the woman he married. Besides, he said when he presented me with the ring in 1984, it was only $15. The ring is silver with a large moonstone flanked by blue. It was not my engagement ring. That was a 1/4 carat perfect diamond. Anyway, the moonstone was too large. My fingers at the time were a child size 4. I took the moonstone ring to be sized. During the 3 days it was at the jeweler's, the 400 square foot apartment my future husband and I had just bought together in Chelsea was burglarized, and my jewelry, including the few pieces I owned that had belonged to my grandmother, was stolen. All I had left was my engagement ring, which was on my hand, and the moonstone ring in the shop. In a few months, I also had a wedding band, and over the years, my husband bought me jewelry, in part to make up for what I had lost. I rarely wore the moonstone, even properly sized. It seemed too big and too serious. Years went by. We moved from one apartment to another and out of Manhattan and had children. The diamond fell out of my engagement ring, never to be found, though the kids had a field day looking for it, pulling the cushions off furniture, sorting through the vacuum cleaner bag. I took off that ring with its empty prongs and thought about wearing the moonstone ring in its stead, but by now my knuckles had thickened and the ring was too small. So I returned it to an established jeweler to be made bigger, only to be told it could not be sized again without destroying it. The ring sat in my top dresser drawer for more than a decade. During this time, a man in our small town opened a jewelry booth inside a liquor and soda store across from the pizza place where I would occasionally browse while I waited for the kids' slices to heat. One day I was looking at a pair of earrings for my cousin when someone dropped off a ring to be sized. "Do you do that?" I said. "Sometimes," he said. I brought in the moonstone and blue gem ring, and he looked at it and said he thought he could enlarge it, despite what the more established jeweler told me. Sure enough, he did it. So now, 29 years after my husband brought the ring from India, I wear it next to my wedding band. Those sapphires, the jeweler says with some surprise, are real. The band slides over my knuckle and the ring fits fine. So now, the postscript to it is that the more established jeweler was destroyed and is gone. The pizzeria was destroyed and is gone. The liquor store is so badly damaged that the owner is going to have to pull out everything down to the sheetrock and doesn't have the money to do it, even with FEMA. The little jewelry booth inside the jeweler had become very successful and moved to another location on Washington Street, which is the main drag, but he's worried now because a lot of his traffic had been people taking the PATH train from Manhattan to shop in Hoboken, and there's no PATH train service. He's hanging in there. My house, my basement, and my home office, which was in the basement, and my desk and my bookcase and my books, and all of that were destroyed. But I'm grateful that my house, the rest of my house, is still there, and I still have the ring.
I'm going to read 2 poems. The first is sort of a little bit of an apocalyptic poem, and the second poem is a New York poem. Say it. The roof collapses. The door shuts with the key inside. It starts to rain and there's no party tent. The pills run out. She still can't sleep. His heart can't say yes. Perhaps they wake years later, different zones, different beds. She thinks of a joke he once told. He thinks how she shook her hair and words tangled in his mouth. Outside, rivers thrash the banks. There's fighting north, migrations east with nothing on their backs. Encampments along the border, metal shacks bulldozed against the full-on glare. She reads about shortages. There are recommendations, what each needs to give up, and she thinks, I can't, won't, don't want to, will. This is a poem called Auspicious Subway, and it's a New York poem. It's the 1 and the 9 train. Auspicious Subway. The man sitting on one side of me is reading Jean Genet, and the woman on the other side is reading the New York Post with the headline, Attack of the Killer Tomato. Across from me, the row of ankles are all crossed. Because, a father says to his son, because I said so is why. The doors shut and stutter open, and 5 kids gangle in speaking Chinese. A layer of orange tulle pokes out from the hem of a blue eyelet dress. At 42nd Street, the New York Post becomes a man in a suit holding a basket of vegetables. 2 blondes ask a man in a hard hat, should we go uptown? A boy with a cello gets off at 68th Street and back on at 72nd, where Jean Genet becomes a girl with a French textbook. Then a man with no book. At 125th Street, a tranny with pink polished toes and delicately strapped red sandals sits down, fishes pen and paper out of her leopard bag, slips them to the man in a hard hat who writes something and hands both back to her. At the next stop, she smiles, toodaloos her purple nails before the doors close. I get off the train at 168th Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, and before I even show the security guard my ID, he asks, how's she doing? And I say, raring to get out of this joint. That's the right idea, he says. And I double-step 5 flights of stairs to the heart ICU, where I Purell my hands, pull on mask and latex gloves, open the 3rd curtain, and sit down next to Nance on her 7th day of an induced coma, catch my breath and say, just you wait, sweetheart. Just wait till you hear what in the world's going on out there.
Hi, I'm Deborah Shupak. I'm going to read a couple poems that don't reference New York or the storm in particular, but there's something about the feeling of these that seemed right for the times. The first one is by Czesław Miłosz, called A Song on the End of the World. On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover, a fisherman mends a glimmering net. Happy porpoises jump in the sea. By the rain spout, young sparrows are playing, and the snake is gold-skinned, as it always should be. On the day the world ends, women walk through the fields under their umbrellas, a drunkard grows sleepy at the edge of a lawn, vegetable peddlers shout in the street, and a yellow-sailed boat comes nearer the island. The voice of a violin lasts in the air and leads into a starry night. And those who expected lightning and thunder are disappointed. And those who expected signs and archangels' trumps do not believe it is happening now. As long as the sun and the moon are above, as long as the bumblebee visits a rose, as long as rosy infants are born, no one believes it is happening now. Only a white-haired old man, who would be a prophet, yet is not a prophet, for he is much too busy, repeats while he binds his tomatoes, there will be no other end of the world. There will be no other end of the world. And then one more that sort of struck me as the inverse of that poem by Jack Gilbert, called Horses at Midnight Without a Moon.
Sounds like the horse.
I think we evoke the spirits.
The last time I was here was for my book party 2 years ago in the summer, and there was no air conditioning. It was about 400 degrees up here. So I guess I'm used to the climate shifts here in the Center for Fiction. Horses at Midnight Without a Moon. Our heart wanders lost in the dark woods. Our dream wrestles in the castle of doubt. But there's music in us. Hope is pushed down, but the angel flies up again, taking us with her. The summer mornings begin inch by inch while we sleep, and walk with us later as long-legged beauty through the dirty streets. It is no surprise that danger and suffering surround us. What astonishes is the singing. We know the horses are there in the dark meadow because we can smell them, can hear them breathing. Our spirit persists like a man struggling through the frozen valley, who suddenly smells flowers and realizes the snow is melting out of sight on top of the mountain, knows that spring has begun.
I already read it, so the next.
I want to say that I really liked how you read that Grace Pandy poem.
Oh, thank you.
You know, she had that way of reading, and you kind of conjured her up. All right, I'm Dan. I'm gonna read 2 short passages from a longer work. 2 women characters, 2 different characters. I just want to say one thing about the hurricane, which is it reminded us, didn't it, that we are neighborhood people. You know, not just neighborhoods right next to other neighborhoods, one devastated, one untouched, but also even among the devastated neighborhoods, you know, the difference between Tribeca and Red Hook and Eastwood, you know, it hit each place in such a different way. This is in the voice of a character named Honey. My brothers used to beat me up a lot. Sometimes they made me watch porno. They thought I wasn't as good as they were. My father, when he bothered to look at me, had a look in his eye of righteousness. My mother just pretended everything was okay and only got all bothered when things didn't look right. As long as they looked right, she didn't know if they were right or not. She didn't want to know if they were right or not. I lost my hearing from the beatings. That meant I went to special schools, and also that I couldn't hear any bad things my family said to me. So I grew up not understanding anything except what I knew was inside me, which wasn't perfect, but was strong, and there was in me the most perfect thing too, my happiness. I felt it all the time. I realized Jewish people, real Jews, understand something about opposites that my father, though he called himself a Jew, never knew about. My father and his people accepted the Jewish faith because the idea of a harsh God appealed to them. But there are other Jews, real Jews too, I think, who balance out the idea of a harsh God with another idea of a gentle people, a wandering people, an afflicted, long-suffering people. I liked that idea. It made me smile. So of course, as soon as I was old enough to leave home, I did. I was already Jewish, small, deaf, poor. I became gay and proud. I used to feel bad for people who were cruel to other people. I saw cruelties of one kind or another everywhere. I didn't feel bad for myself. I don't know why, I just didn't. Life was good and getting better. My friends were my family now. I lived for love and entertainment. I found a lot of the time that people who had it easier than me often had a harder time than I did finding love. I was very upfront about it. If I had a friend, I would usually ask them if they wanted to sleep with me. Too often they said no. I say too often because it wasn't like there wasn't room in their lives for me or that they didn't have needs. It was more about how people can't always handle so much directness. When they said yes, it was great. When they said no, I knew that usually it was just about how they didn't know how to break through the shell of their loneliness. The hard thing for me was finding work. I could tell you stories, all the reasons people find not to hire a poor Jewish, gay, deaf girl. I felt bad for them, each and every one of them. I tried babysitting, book publishing, emergency medical technician, home care nursing assistant, anything that would give me some protection in the workplace. I took classes. I was enthusiastic and diligent, but it never got any easier. As a handicapped person, I can tell you this, it isn't what you think. If people only knew themselves better, it would be easier for us. But they are so busy reassuring themselves. It would be better if people acknowledged the problems they have with other people. Then they'd be able to actually work on those problems and overcome them. But people don't ever realize the ways handicapped people scare them. So their problems become our problems because we see them and they don't, only we don't need more problems. Okay, and this is a different character. This is also a woman named Electra. Electra is suddenly saying to Ren is kind of the main character. Electra is suddenly saying to Ren, out of the blue, do you remember my semester off after sophomore year when I traveled? Well, I met a guy. It was when I had an apartment for a while in the outskirts of Paris. He was Belgian, a brilliant guitarist in the Django Reinhardt style, unbelievably talented. Joy every time he touched the guitar, a sound like water on stone, acoustic or lightly amplified, but never loud, very classical sounding, come to think of it. Anyway, he was in school to become a pastry chef. And at the very last moment he jumped, dropped out of school right before the final exam, because he knew that the option of a regular life and a regular job as a pastry chef would destroy his music, would destroy him. But before he dropped out, he came over to where I was staying to visit one Sunday. He hadn't ever come to me before. That was the first time. It was near the end of the semester, April, early May, a few weeks before the end of the school year. He had made his decision. I realized afterward, though he didn't say a word about that to me. I remember we mostly were sitting in my little kitchen. He kept looking over at the oven. It was a big and ancient four, and I hardly ever used it. Come to think of it, I was a little scared of it. And anyway, he kept looking over at it as we sat at my little kitchen table talking, and finally he said something that didn't make sense to me at first, which was just to apologize in advance because he wasn't well acquainted with my oven, hadn't cooked in it before, but that if it was okay, he was going to bake a cake for me. Just something very simple, a gâteau de Breton, the simplest cake in the world. He had brought the ingredients with him, just flour, sugar, eggs, and butter. He needed only water and a little salt. And then I watched him. He never measured anything. Poured in the sugar, the flour, and the water, worked in the eggs, a little salt, worked the batter in the mixing bowl, his arm around the mixing bowl, working it with a wooden spoon. Something almost feverish in what he was doing, whirling the spoon, the mixture thick, beads of sweat on his face, feeling and looking, letting in, but never counting or quantifying. He was a pâtissier. I realized it was in him, calling. Not something he had studied, but something he had shed his human skin to become. And now something he was giving up, had given up, though he hadn't told me this yet. A choice that was at the same time for and against himself, an eradication at the same time as it was an embrace. And he was including me and at the same time shutting me out. He didn't speak at all while he worked, not until the cake was in the oven, almost as if he'd been in a trance. And it was then that I realized how it isn't about the choices we make after all, but the things we give up.
I'm Steve. I'm glad to be here because the only thing I've done for the victims of the flood is to hope that my survivor guilt would benefit them. I looked for something in my own work that would be appropriate and found absolutely nothing. So I'm just going to read the first section of a story called Hymen the Magnificent, which is a series of disasters. First disaster is called the Straitjacket Challenge. I was in the audience at the Idle Hour Cinema with my mother and father for my friend Jaime Weiss's amateur night debut. That was on North Main Street in the spring of 1927. There were several acts preceding Hymen. The first was Mr. Dreyfus, the jeweler, who'd aspired to be a comedian ever since Mogalesco's touring company had played the Workman's Circle Lodge Hall. The problem was that Mr. Dreyfus knew only a couple of jokes, which he repeated at each performance, so that everyone already had them by heart. As a consequence, the earnest jeweler found himself in the role of straight man to his own shtick of riddles and gags. His favorite was the one that went, "What hangs on a wall is green and whistles," to which the audience would answer in a chorus so loud that plaster fell from the ceiling. "A herring," says Mr. Dreyfus, flapping his baggy pants in case you hadn't noticed. "Since when does a herring hang on the wall?" Audience, "Who stops you from hanging it?" Mr. Dreyfus, adjusting a rubber nose scarcely larger than his bulbous original. "Is a herring green?" Audience, "You could paint it." Mr. Dreyfus, "But who ever heard a herring whistle?" Audience, "No, so it doesn't whistle." Mr. Dreyfus does a modest hornpipe to Mrs. Elster's organ, exiting to raucous applause. Next, the little Elster girl, done up in blackface like Topsy, commenced a bubble-eyed tap dance, making window-washing gestures with the flat of her hands. Her mama, the resident organist, accompanied her in a medley of Stephen Foster tunes. Wearing a false beard that covered his goiter, Ike Taubenblatt, the shoe repairman, did the blow, wind, crack your cheeks speech from Shakespeare. Mrs. Bedower juggled 3 rolling pins, and Manny Blinkman swallowed a light bulb, only to belch it back up again. Hannah Abrams sang the 3-handkerchief rendition of the Tsarist Recruit's Farewell through a megaphone. Then it was Hymen's turn to perform what he talked Mr. Forbitz, the theater manager, into announcing as the evening pièce de résistance. He came on dressed like the Phantom of the Opera in a get-up borrowed from Nussbaum's Dry Goods Emporium. With a flourish, he doffed the top hat and removed his silk cloak, revealing a sleeveless undershirt that showed off his stringy physique. When he handed the hat and cloak to his assistant, my sister Miriam, there was polite applause, though whether it was for Hymen or Miriam, who was an uncommonly dishy girl, was hard to say. In either case, Hymen had the attention of the house. Having placed the accessories over a chair, Miriam took up the stiff sailcloth straitjacket trimmed in leather. This while Hymen, running a hand through his upstanding auburn hair, announced gravely, "Ladies and gentlemen, for your express delectation, I will attempt Houdini's famous punishment suit release." Then, as Miriam held the straitjacket in front of him, Hymen thrust his hands into the sleeves, which overlapped the ends of his outstretched arms. He gave her the nod, and Miriam turned to the tittering crowd. "Hymen," she mumbled in her sandal-shod toes, to her sandal-shod toes, nervously flouncing the handkerchief points of her skirt. But when some of the onlookers demanded she speak up, she repeated almost defiantly, "Hymen," pronounced high man. The magnificent request volunteers from the audience. Practically all the young men in the theater, eager to assist Hymen's assistant, rose and stampeded the stage. Miriam glanced sheepishly at Hymen, who maintained his rigid pose but rolled his eyes as the small stage was overrun by the sons of North Main Street. Conspicuous among them was Bernie Saperstein, the most aggressive of my sister's suitors, looking spruce in his canary blazer and waxed mustache. Shouldering his way to the forefront of the would-be volunteers, he left Miriam no recourse but to choose him to help fasten Hymen's restraints. She also chose, probably to compensate for Bernie's vigor, the consumptive Milton Pincus. Exercising somewhat more zeal than was called for, Bernie went to work on the buckles and straps, slapping down Milton's hands whenever he tried to pitch in. With his torso constricted until he turned the blue of moldy cheese, Hymen spoke in a voice trapped somewhere in his diaphragm. "The committee will confirm," he managed hoarsely, "that the punishment suit is secure." Bernie tugged at the jacket and smugly grinned his assent. "And now," croaked Hymen, "as I say the mystical word anthropologos," which I mouthed along with him. "Miss Rosen, if you please." Miriam rolled out a gauze hospital modesty curtain from stage left and folded its panels around Hymen. Then she said what she'd been coached to say, the phrase uttered by Bess Houdini before shutting up her husband in his various cabinets. Je tire le rideau comme ça. It means I draw the curtain thus, I told my mama next to me, who grunted that I shouldn't be such a wizened. Stepping to one side, Miriam made an artistic gesture and smiled unconvincingly, embarrassed as always by her own drop-dead beauty. Mrs. Elster played an appropriately suspenseful signature on her organ, while I pictured Hymen behind the curtain, drinking in the moment he waited for. Mentally, I prompted him, reciting under my breath the pertinent passage from magical rope ties and escapes. The first step in freeing oneself from the jacket is to place an elbow on some solid foundation, and by sheer strength, the ordinarily boisterous amateur night audience were subdued as they listened to the sounds of the struggle behind the curtain. They remained almost reverent, even as the curtain toppled over on its clattering frame, revealing Hymen wrestling furiously with himself. He thrashed around like a cat in a bag, flinging his hampered body here and there, assuming contortions certain to cause him an injury. Against the painted asbestos backdrop, Miriam had begun to chew her braid, her pale cheeks gone intensely crimson. The jaws of the volunteers hung collectively open. Then Bernie Saperstein, always a joker, called out, "Somebody get the rabbi, there's a demon in Hymen Weiss." And the whole theater split their sides. This was Mrs. Elster's cue to strike up a rollicking tune. The general hilarity seemed only to encourage Hymen's violent behavior. Puffed with concern, Mr. Forbitz marched out of the wings, shooing everyone from the boards. "All right, Weiss," he blustered, dewlap swaying. "That's enough already, schon genug." "Stop it, Hymen," cried Miriam, stomping her foot, but her agitation on his behalf, if anything, only fueled his abandon. At length, Mr. Forbitz returned to the wings and lowered the movie screen with a dust-raising thud, thus separating the spectators from Hymen's ordeal. He stepped back out again to signal the projectionist, upon which the lights went out, a beam shot over our heads, and the picture began. It was John Barrymore, a John Barrymore melodrama entitled The Beloved Rogue. Even torture could not quell the spirit of the vagabond poet, the posters read, for whose credits Mrs. Elster modulated her rollicking organ. The rooftops of medieval Paris, brooded over by Notre Dame, appeared to be caught in a blizzard of blackbirds, so poor was the quality of the film. What's more, as the dauntless vagabond swaggered into the frame, the screen, patched and seamed as an old topsail, began to flutter from the goings-on behind it. The crooked streets rippled as if in an earthquake, and the audience howled over the distortions. Then, in the side of a house from whose window a bosomy lady was waving, a fissure opened, and Hymen hurtled through. Still in the throes of his desperate struggle, he lurched headlong into the orchestra pit, breaking an arm.